How can we scientifically learn a foreign language? Hello and welcome to Communication Psychology. My name is Gerhard Erlbaum. I'm a psychologist from Hamburg, Germany, specialized in communication psychology in international, intercultural and multilanguage contexts. Today we are returning to one of my former favorite topics. Apart from being a psychologist and working at the university and as a private consultant, I've, during the last 20 years, always taught different foreign languages. If you're somehow interested, I have very exclusive circles or groups for German, English, and Danish. Please let me know. However, today we are talking about the science of learning a foreign language, which maybe or probably is highly relevant to you if you are engaging in international situations. You are at a conference, at a trade show, you need to explore new markets, you have colleagues from other countries that don't know your language well enough. So the probability is very high that it's expected of you to learn a foreign language. Now, we won't do a too deep dive into the scientific literature. In the recommended reading list, I put you just 5 scientific texts. The problem is that, as in many other areas of our life, people typically do not care at all about what the science says. HR often is another such area. As in HR, especially in foreign language acquisition, foreign language learning, the scene is dominated by tradition. We do things that we have been doing for the last 50, 80 years. So if something is correct or not, if how the teacher behaves is correct or not, depends on our comparisons with what we experienced at school. And this is typically in contradiction to what the science would recommend. But as people are not aware of this area of research, and if they are aware because it's too inaccessible, it's incomprehensible to read, or the respective literature is not accessible in your native language, for example, then this typically gets ignored. So we typically rely on tradition and we rely on the availability heuristics. That is, we see what is most readily available to learn a foreign language, and probably it's one of the most popular language learning apps. And then we conclude that probably this is the best way to do this. Now, we cannot go too deep into all those theories, but for me, as a practitioner also, I would separate first 2 basic directions. That one is based on input and the other is based on output. Now, what most or many language learners in different countries I have been to and have contact with typically want is they want something that doesn't expose them to any kind of risk. And the risk is impression management. We don't want to look stupid, and speaking in another language would make us stupid. It's the same if somebody asks of you to change your accent. So if you're an American, just impersonate an Australian or New Zealand or Irish accent, you would feel strange. It's not yours. People may laugh at you. So learning a foreign language is such an area where we very highly expose ourselves to the risk of making mistakes, of looking stupid. We don't want this. So we cling to some language learning methods or techniques or materials that cater to our fear. That is, we typically fear speaking, and if we are forced to speak, we would prefer to read a dialogue, to memorize things. So if the teacher accommodates to this and works with us with written grammar exercises, everything is explained ahead, so you never encounter the risk of not understanding something, of making mistakes, of pronouncing something wrong. So you want at the first lessons to be very clear about all the pronunciation rules, so you will never ever make a mistake in pronunciation. So you want to have everything without the risk to your personal reputation. Now, the problem is that almost all scientific theories supposes you to engage in risk. And if you remember how children learn anything, basically, it's always with a risk involved. So if you want to take out the risk, any risk of learning something, and especially a foreign language, you're basically sabotaging your own progress. Because what you will do is you will make very, very small steps, and then you will repeat them because you feel comfortable that you know something, and you will go in circles, and you will avoid everything that's dangerous. So what happens typically? Well, if we are forced to listen to something, then if we have the choice, we prefer something that has subtitles. We prefer something that is made for beginners. So what will happen? We'll find a YouTube channel that has something specifically for us beginners, and we will avoid all contact with real material, like things native speakers consume, and we'll stay in this comfort zone for 1 year, for 2 years. I know many students who are quite good speakers, but they are still afraid of watching talk shows even in their personal interest zone, or of reading real books. That's too difficult. I cannot do this. So if they had exposed themselves to the risk of not understanding everything right from the beginning, well, after 5 years, they would be reading lots of books and watching talk shows without any problem. But the fear of making mistakes, the fear of looking stupid, ignorant, makes us to choose learning methods that are not productive. So people want, typically language learners, they think, well, I'm the customer, so the customer is king, and language schools want to have lots of students, online teachers want to have lots of students. Well, then typically you adapt to the demands of the market. It's logic. It would be stupid to do otherwise. So. But then you have, after some years, you have a big part of the language learning population that is unsatisfied. We learned English at school, Spanish at school. There was a study, and I recommend the book. It's not in the reading list, but it's called The Case Against Education by, I think he's from George Mason University, economist Brian Kaplan. And he cites a US government study, a survey among adults. Less than 1% of American adults report they had learned a foreign language, probably Spanish, very well. That's good. So the results are very not very positive, not very productive, but still the fear of having damage to our self-image is higher. So let's summarize. What would be a scientific approach be? So the input hypothesis would be to consume content that is challenging to you. Now, the original hypothesis would say, well, it's content that is slightly above your current knowledge. Well, we can debate about this. Of course, for example, if I'm learning Chinese and I know nothing of Chinese, well, listening every day to Chinese radio is probably much higher than I can process. That's clear. However, I still would recommend doing this periodically or from time to time as a background, because even if it's too high above your level, you still subconsciously, unintentionally process features of the language, like the melody, and so become acquainted with the language, accustomed to the language. And it's also psychologically important because you will reduce the stress of unfamiliarity. So you already feel at home when people speak Chinese, even if you don't understand everything. But ideally, yes, you have materials that is slightly above, but not at the same level. So you need to have challenges here. Then the other part of hypotheses, and by the way, you can count them differently, but there are between 10 and 15 major theories for language acquisition, maybe between 30 and 50 sub-theories, frameworks, models of foreign language acquisition. So it's not that there is one universally accepted model for this. At the end, as a learner, you need to make decisions. What do I pick? What does my teacher pick? The other type of theory would say, well, you need to produce a lot in the foreign language. That is, you could write a diary, you could make your own videos, you need to produce a lot in challenging situations. You need to have a lot of stress trying to express something, not being able to do this stress will force you to learn the words you need, because you will encounter all your vocabulary gaps and grammar gaps. So forcing you to produce something, an output in the foreign language, shows you exactly all your blind spots. You cannot escape, especially if you force yourself to explain more difficult topics. If you film yourself and watch it, you see immediately what is missing in your grammar and your vocabulary. And then you work on that. So input or output. And then there are theories that say, well, you need to interact with people. And in those interactions, which also include risks, stress, and ignorance on your behalf, over time you will negotiate, the meaning of words and grammar structures and so on. Now, ideally, because we are not certain which theory is the correct one, and also it depends on each personality, of course, you should have a mix. You should have a lot of challenging input, and you should regularly, daily produce something in the foreign language. Yeah, and then you should have interactions in also challenging situations. But this would be a more scientific approach. What we would like is we have a book and it explains some vocabulary, and we do exercises and a small text with no unknown word. All words are explained, all grammar is explained. But then we fall into the category of those more than 99% in America and in many other countries that leave school with exactly the same method and say as adults, well, I'm afraid speaking Spanish, French, because even though I had many years the respective language at school. So if you are interested in topics like language learning, in the history of this channel, you will find many videos and episodes on similar topics. We returned a bit because I had students facing those questions. If you want me to if you want to invite me to make a lecture on psychology of communication, please find my contact detail here. Bye bye.